So let's go over what each of these actually does. Now that we know what all the different effects you can have from your now we know what all the different effects are, we're going to go over these. And there's also a little bit of a hidden effect in death and versus in growth. That isn't super obvious. So, Order in Turmoil gives you a 5% bonus per rank and reduces unrest or increases unrest, and increases or decreases the odds of events happening. So, Order is the scale people typically take like 3 of if they are a blood hunting nation. Again, something to be covered later, but suffice it to say, blood hunting nations generate unrest in their own provinces, and that means that they really like having unrest reduction. This unrest reduction, let's see, there's 2 ways to reduce unrest in your provinces. One is to put up province defense, and it just passively reduces unrest every turn. And the other way is to patrol your provinces. This reduces a lot of unrest, but it kills your population, which no one likes that. So this unrest reduction will not kill your population, right? You'll get 3 additional unrest reduction per turn that does not kill your population, which with a small amount of PD gives you about 4 per turn. Which is a pretty nice bonus over a long period of time to not killing off your source of income. So that's a pretty big bonus for those nations. It looks better than growth, right? Because the growth is only 9% income, right? But as I mentioned earlier, growth secretly gives you a larger bonus after turn 10. Now, productivity. This is a kind of a bad scale. A lot of people have talked about buffing it in some way, but what you need to know for playing base dominions is that this scale is kind of weak. So this only gives you 2% income. That's obviously not very much compared to the 5% you get from Order, or the secretly more than 5% per rank you get from growth. Which also means that the penalties for taking negative stats are very bad. But what is this resource thing here? Oh, I didn't actually talk about resources. I'm sorry. Alright, so what does resources plus 15% mean exactly? I did. Alright, resources essentially determines how many units you can recruit per turn. But it's not like a strict number, like 100 resources gives you 5 units per turn. It depends on what nation you're playing. The armor and weapons of various units have a resource cost. Units also have a base resource cost. It basically represents like feeding them, although there's also supplies for food, but giving them clothes and giving them weapons and armor. And large units like giants obviously take more resources to produce their armor and weapons. And so some nations will have very heavily armored units like knights and whatnot, and these require a lot of resources. And you might also play like a tribal nation that runs around in loincloths, and obviously loincloths don't take a lot of resources. You just need a couple bits of cloth or some animal skin, whatever. So the heavily armored nations actually need this stat. Baratos, for example, could use like 1 productivity to have the little bit of a bonus to resources. Something you should keep in mind is that resources are given to your forts by adjacent provinces, or rather, your forts kind of steal them from adjacent provinces. So when you have a fort that's surrounded by a large number of adjacent provinces, it's going to get a large resource bonus from that. Now, you can also build multiple forts to produce units out of. So what does this mean? The more forts you build, the more units you can produce per turn. And at some point, you're going to have not enough gold to produce all the units you have resources for. So if you've put points into production and you will fairly easily reach this point where you've run out of gold but you still have resources left over between all your forts, you've essentially wasted that production scale and you should have taken no bonus or sloth. Now, a lot of nations in Dominions can get away with taking sloth, and the reason for that is because taking sloth is something that you can play around. You can specifically try and capture good territory to put up forts. There are terrain effects that'll make it better to put up a fort somewhere like forests or mountains. You can specifically try and plan out a way to get around the fact that you've taken an unusual amount of sloth and it's preventing your unit recruitment. And it's mostly going to slow you down near the start of the game. So especially also if you take an Awake Expander Pretender, which we're going to talk about in a bit, that's something that you can get around. Now let's talk about temperature. Baratos is actually, although I didn't think of this at the time, a really good nation to use as an example for this. Different nations have different heat and cold preferences. For a lot of human nations, the base is 0, no particular amount of heat or cold. Now, temperature differences from whatever your nation prefers are always bad, and they're pretty severely bad too. It's a 5% per rank income penalty. The supply penalty you don't really need to worry about. In general, Dominion's provinces tend to have too much supplies, so it's something that's you're very rarely going to encounter. Um, so the income penalty aspect, though, is definitely something you want to avoid as much as possible because more income means more troops, more mages, more good stuff for you in general. Um, Everyone would like to have more income than they currently have. So for Baratos, the ideal amount of heat is 1, but during the course of the year in the game, there are actual seasons, and it gets cold in the winter and warm in the summer, and it's kind of whatever in spring and fall. So that means that in spring and fall, you're going to be at your 1 heat scale and happy, but in the middle of summer, it's going to go to 3 heat. In the middle of winter, it's going to go to 2 or 3 cold. Now, something to remember about that is that when you're at 2 cold, right, for this nation, you're going to have negative 15 to your income, right? But what about when you're at 3 heat? You only have minus 10. That's because it's determined by the difference from your preference and to what it actually is currently at, right? So that means during the middle of summer, you're fine. That's three heat, no big deal. But what happens in the middle of winter? It might go down to 0 heat. Well, that's only a 5% penalty. So if you, on a heat 1 nation, take heat 3, right, which gives you more design points, by the way, if I haven't mentioned that yet, taking bad scales gives you design points. Heat is bad. Heat and cold are bad in every direction. So any difference from your national preference gives you more design points. So if I take heat 3, that means it's gonna change throughout the year from a 5% penalty to a 10% penalty. But what if I left it at heat 1, right? That means that it's going to change throughout the year from a 15% penalty all the way back to a 10% penalty. That's should be fairly obviously worse than going from 5 to 10% with some of the years spent at 0 penalty, right? So that means that on a nation like Baratos, and really any like preference 1 nation, you almost always want to take heat or cold 3 in whatever direction their preference is. And on a heat or cold 0 nation, though, you only want to take, say, you only want to take some penalty like 1 cold or 1 heat. Now, you might wonder, well, which do you take? Is the one that's better if you are a preference 0 nation? And the answer is cold. Cold is better. There are some exceptions, however. If you're going up against a nation that really likes heat scales or cold scales, or even gets some benefit from them, for example, units with heat fire resistance get a bonus when fighting in heat, sort of, relative to units that don't. That is to say, you get a penalty for fighting in hot or cold scales if you don't have heat or cold resistance. Your units will fatigue out. Excuse me. Your units will fatigue out faster, and that's another thing for a whole separate video where we can talk about fatigue in combat and stuff, but it's enough to know that it's bad and you don't want it to happen, which means that you want to inflict it on your opponents if you can. So if you're fighting a nation like Abyssea that loves heat and has massive heat resistance, moving your scales towards cold 1 or 2 will help provide them with a penalty when they're trying to invade you. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're making that choice. So if you're fighting a nation that likes cold, like Niflheim, that might be a good reason to take heat 1, even though normally cold 1 is better. Now, why is cold 1 better for a nation with no preference, right? Well, cold 1 is better because during the first year, you start in spring, right? And you move over into winter. So during the first 6 turns or so, you're going to have first no temperature penalty, and then you're going to start getting heat scales, right? So a cold 1 scale is going to offset those heat scales to give you a larger or smaller income penalty during the first year, whereas heat 1 will just already start off bad and then get worse and then stay bad for a long time, and eventually it'll start paying off near the end of year 1. But the end of year 1 isn't as important a period for you as the beginning of year 1 and the middle of it. So that's why you take a cold scale if you are a 0 no preference nation. Alright, what else do I need to cover on scales? Let's talk about growth, and then I think we're actually done here, although I'll mention what the other ones are really quick. Growth and death are pretty obvious. Death is the largest income penalty you can take. Growth is the largest income benefit you can take because it increases population and then gives you bonus income on the new population you get over time. But it has a deadly secret, and that is that old characters get old in Dominions, right? A lot of very skilled mages tend to start out being old, and magical ability affects your mage's aging as well, right? Fire mages get old at a younger age, right? They kind of age faster. So, growth reduces the odds that your mages will become diseased and die of old age, which is pretty great when you start to look at how expensive some of these mages are, and especially since it tends to be the most expensive mages that are old age and ready to die. Now, if you're a non-human nation, you don't have to usually worry about this. Elves live a very long time, kind of Tolkien-esque. Elves have a multi-hundred-year lifespan, and they don't have to deal with these kind of petty problems. But, a lot of humans are going to live to be like 60, and they start out at 58. That's a pretty big deal. Especially since age is a little bit randomized. So, nations like... what's a really good nation that needs this? No, excuse me. Nations like the later ages of Abyssia, where they don't have their Abyssian heritage as much. Nations like Marverni, I believe the Druids are pretty old. Nations like Marignon, especially. Marignon has really brutal age penalties because they're human fire mages that have a lot of fire magic and a lot of magic pathing. So they start out being quite old. And if you don't have growth 3 scales, they'll die off pretty quickly, and it'll be a pretty big penalty to you, especially since you have these mages you can only recruit on your capital fort. You can only recruit one every other turn, and then the poor bastard dies on you. So now we've got Fortune, Misfortune. We've already looked at what these scales do. More events, and the events are more good, or more events, and the events are more bad. Something I should mention is you don't want to take Misfortune 3. Taking Misfortune 2 with, Order 3 to kind of offset that increased odds of events is a fairly common thing to do, and it's bad for you, but it's not that bad. Misfortune 3, I believe, opens up more bad events that can happen to you, and it's kind of like that tipping point where the bonuses are too brutal to handle, and it isn't really worth it, typically. In Magic and Drain does have another secret effect, actually, that I almost forgot about, but... Alright, so in high magic scales reduce the amount of fatigue for casting spells. Drain scales, their penalty version, increases the amount of fatigue for casting spells as well. In 2 magic scales, right? If your magic scales are at 2, it will reduce the magic resistance of troops in those scales by 1, and in Drain 2 it will increase troops that are sitting around in a province with those scales by 1. This is relevant for a few spells that check against magic resistance, and if you make these essentially like a saving throw, a roll for magic resistance, you aren't affected by the spell, and if you fail your roll, you are affected by the spell. Typically, being affected by the spell is bad, but if you're playing a nation that has a ton of those spells to use on your opponents, you might want to have magic scales, not Drain scales. Taking Drain is a bad idea on most nations. Taking magic scales, however, isn't worth it on most nations, so you tend to go 0 on a lot of nations. The exception are nations that have really big mages, can take Drain 1 or 2. Nations that have really small mages, like the little... I can't remember what they're called, but Marverni gets these Astral 1 mages that are very cheap, Stargazers, I think, that really benefit from magic scales. And then there are a couple special nations, like a Middle Age Ulm, that do not take a penalty from Drain scales. They have a special ability that prevents them from taking a penalty for Drain scales, so you just throw on even Drain 3, which unlocks some very bad events and you don't normally take. You could even throw on Drain 3 on them, because they don't really care about Drain scales. Alright, so that covers scales, we've covered imprisonment, and now we have to go on to magic paths. And then I can finally actually talk about pretenders.